First speakers representing our today's co-host, the Center for Civilians in Conflict. I will first introduce Alexander and later on Serhiy. Mr. Alexander Griff is the Ukraine Country Director at Civic, leading a team of experts in providing policy advice and technical assistance to the Ukrainian government on civilian harm mitigation. He and his team also engage with the civil society and international partners to advocate for the rights and the needs of the conflict-affected communities. He has over 10 years of humanitarian expertise and experience with a focus on protection of civilians, visiting people deprived of liberty, humanitarian diplomacy, and negotiations. He has previously worked for the International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, in Myanmar, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and Libya. With a Master's of Arts in International Relations and Affairs from the Fletcher School of Tufts University and a bachelor degree in Arabic languages and literature from University of Vienna, he speaks 6 languages. Mr. Serhiy is the Civic Senior Advisor in Ukraine. He joined Civic in January 2017. In 2017 up to 2022, he contributed to launching numerous initiatives at the Armed Forces of Ukraine, including introduction of civilian harm tracking policies and practices, as well as training the AFU officers in incorporating of protection of civilians in armed conflicts into combat operations planning. He served as an officer in the Armed Forces of Ukraine in 2014 till 15 and in 2022 till 2023 in various positions at the high level of field command and in the course of large-scale invasions to Ukraine, and was honorably discharged with duties in July 23 in the rank of a major. Since July 23, he returned to his work as a senior military advisor at Civic. His interests include societal resilience, civil-military cooperation, civilian harm tracking and mitigation, as well as analysis of NATO standards and practices vis-à-vis his first-hand experience of a combat officer and a veteran of the Ukraine-Russia war. Alexander, I'm very happy to have you on board. Serhiy, I'm very happy to have you on board, and I suppose we start with Alexander. We're happy to look into your presentation.
Ralph, thank you so much for this wonderful introduction, and a big thank you to the NATO Center of Excellence for hosting us today and allowing us to speak to such a distinguished audience about the relevance of the protection of civilians and civil-military cooperation in Ukraine. We hope that through today's presentation, we will show you how civil-military cooperation and its role in the protection of civilians has transformed during the large-scale and high-intensity conflict that we've been witnessing in Ukraine since 2014. Before we get into the lessons learned and the overview of what we as Civic have noticed in this field, I would like to take a second to give you an overview of Civic as a global organization that works on protection of civilians and an insight in how we do that. So if we could move over to the next slide. So Civic is an international non-governmental organization, and for the last 20 years had a mission to support communities affected by conflict and to protect them and strengthen their resolve of armed actors to prevent and respond to civilian harm. What does that mean? It means that we believe that civilians are not collateral damage and that every party to conflict can do more to prevent civilian harm wherever they are. We also believe that civilians are not just victims, and I think today's presentation and today's discussion will bring that out very clearly. But more than ever, civilians have agency over what they believe is the best way for them to survive and stay safe during a conflict. We also believe that armed actors must be held accountable for preventing and addressing civilian harm, and we believe that direct engagement with armed actors and civilians is necessary to significantly reduce harm to civilians and improve protection outcomes. Therefore, we believe that there are 3 approaches that can achieve the goals that we set out. One is a community-based protection approach and is strongly linked to what I said about the agency of civilians in a conflict. it is the most important that all actors, including the government, the militaries, and all parties to the conflict, directly engage with the people that are most affected by an ongoing conflict. At a recent conference for explosive weapons in populated areas, it was made clear that over 90% of the people who are affected and who are killed by explosive weapons in populated areas are civilians. And therefore, a direct engagement with civilians is the key element to a successful strategy to reduce and mitigate civilian harm. At Civic, and specifically at Civic in Ukraine, we have a program that engages directly with civilians and links them up with local authorities to give them the means and tools to figure out the biggest protection threats that they face. And then together with the actors, whether the government or the military, figure out how to address these concerns in the most efficient way. We also believe in civilian harm mitigation. Civilian harm mitigation is an important tool that we want to use to make sure that all measures are taken to prevent and minimize civilian harm. This needs to be based in an evidence-based and data-driven approach, which requires militaries to trace the harm done by their military operations and by enemy military operations and their impact on civilians to ensure that the lessons learned are incorporated into the military planning exercises and into military operations. For that matter, the Ukrainian military was one of the first militaries in the world to put in place a civilian harm tracking group to learn from the patterns that they could identify that harm civilians the most. And third, we believe that protection of civilians from other actors is a very, very important point to prevent and reduce civilian harm. Protection of civilians from other actors are actions aimed at preventing or responding to threats of physical violence against civilians posed by other actors, including armed non-state actors in government. For example, Civic undertakes research and advocacy to strengthen United Nations peacekeeping mandates, policies, and operations to better protect civilians at risk of violence and perpetrated by others. In countries like Ukraine, we understand that sometimes, or very often, Russia is not as willing to listen to recommendations of how to reduce civilian harm. On the contrary, we see that Ukraine and the Ukrainian military is very willing to learn from the patterns that we see on the battlefield and try to improve the situation for civilians wherever they can. Globally, Civic works in different regions of this world, including in Ukraine, in Yemen, in Somalia, in the Sahel region, in Nigeria, in Niger, and in Mali. We do as well have our headquarters in Geneva, in Brussels, and in Washington. Next slide, please. Okay. I've already mentioned that we work directly with affected communities. We work with governments and armed actors. We work with multinational bodies such as the United Nations and NATO, and we work with civil society. Civic is all about working with the people who are directly affected by the conflict, take the lessons from that work to decision makers at a national level, and then extrapolate best practices to the international level where policies are made for the protection of civilians. And these policies is what Civic is championing worldwide, whether it's our contribution to the explosive weapons on populated areas or our contribution to the US policy on civilian harm mitigation. This is where Civic wants to be, to make sure that the voices of civilians and what they tell us they need the most is implemented in practices and policies around the world. Next slide, please. More concretely, in Ukraine, that meant that for the last 2 years, we didn't only want to do field work, but we also wanted to focus on research and analysis. And so we looked at 4 different research topics that you can find on our homepage. We started with trying to understand what is it that are the sources of harm for the civilian population in Ukraine. And therefore, what are the threats that civilians are most affected by? And we came out with concrete recommendations, including working with the local authorities to engage communities to determine whether they have identified people who require special assistance for evacuations and protection from bombardment. This research clearly showed that even though Ukraine was prepared to face Russia's full-scale invasion, civilians sometimes still were left to their own devices, and the engagement with the population could have been better to prevent civilian casualties. After that research, we wanted to understand the information environment that civilians face. And so we wanted to understand what kind of sources do civilians use to make informed decisions about their safety and well-being. We did so because we understood that civilians that did not receive clear instructions from their authorities about how to behave had to make decisions fast and had to make decisions quickly about what choices to make. And so we wanted to understand what those early warning systems were. Did people use social media? Did people use the television? And one of our findings that I think is very relevant to this workshop is that in the early stages of 2022, most people identified the armed forces of Ukraine as the most reliable source of information that helped them make decisions about whether to evacuate, whether to shelter, whether to relocate, whether to move, or whether to stay in place. The next research, and that's the research I think that is also most pertinent to our presentation today, was the role of civil-military cooperation in the protection of civilians. In 2014, when after the Maidan revolution, Ukraine asked NATO to join, and as part of NATO's support to Ukraine, the armed forces of Ukraine started adopting NATO's military structure and NATO doctrines, including the J9 and the J9 doctrine. And we saw that after that, that doctrine was developed into a full operational body or arm of the military that actively engaged with the civilian population, coordinated evacuations, coordinated the distribution of humanitarian aid, and was one of the Ukrainian military's advantages in understanding the human environment and, until today, making decisions that are beneficial for the protection of the civilian population. And our last research of last year was about the role of disinformation. Now, specifically, the role of disinformation and the tangible harm it has caused to people in Ukraine, which means that we're not talking about strategic global picture disinformation and how the war in Ukraine is perceived by other states and how that changes their support or views of the war in Ukraine. Rather, we wanted to know what kind of disinformation is affecting civilians' decision-making and their safety as a result. I would like to add that Civic understands that disinformation and information warfare is part of a military strategy. And therefore, we focused on misinformation targeted at civilians that, at least in our point of view, has no discernible military advantage and yet disproportionately harms the civilian population. To give you an example, when the Kakhovka Dam was destroyed, a lot of people turned to social media, to their Telegram groups, to decide which direction to evacuate in, because the flooding has caused a lot of indicators to disappear. The road signs were gone, the roads were gone, and people didn't know where to go. And the Telegram groups were one source where they could decide which direction to flee in. And these Telegram groups that sometimes were created by groups affiliated to the Russian government pointed people in the direction of occupied territories. And therefore, Ukrainian civilians found themselves, instead of in the safety of Ukrainian armed forces, found themselves in Russian occupied territories, where, according to the latest reports by the United Nations for Human Rights, they face oppression and are pushed to accept Russian identity and renounce their Ukrainian identity. We also had many other examples, including the discreditation of the health system along the front line, which meant that people who could go to the hospital very quickly instead took perilous routes to reach a hospital which is far away. And on the way to the hospital, their cars or means of transportation were destroyed, leading to harm and death. All this research we did to inform global policymaking and global decision making about how the protection of civilians looks like in a modern armed conflict. Next slide, please. So the last slide before I hand over to Sergey to talk about today's topic was, what are the key challenges that civilians face today when we talk about the conflict in Ukraine? Well, the targeting of civilians is definitely one issue that civilians struggle with. We see that since February 2022, conflict-related violence has killed at least 10,000 civilians and injured another 20,000. However, we believe that these numbers are much higher than the actual toll that has been confirmed by independent and neutral actors. The use of explosive weapons, the continued use of explosive weapons, which is a global problem, is especially visible in Ukraine, where we have many densely populated areas that are continuously being struck by these explosive weapons and cause excessive harm to the civilian population. It is not new to you that the critical national infrastructure continues to be the target of Russian attacks. And we see that the population continues to suffer from the lack of access to heating, to water, to electricity. Protracted conflict is likely to compound the risks and increase the impact of damage as resilience is strained and multiple crises occur. The latest study has shown that civilians in the winter of 2022 had to live without electricity or heating between 4 to 6 weeks in temperatures that range well below zero. Last, we also have limited bomb shelters available for the population, even though there are daily air raid alarms and daily airstrikes from population centers. In some places in Ukraine, with a population of over 100,000 people, you have only 17 functioning shelters. And lastly, disinformation. As we mentioned before, this is a big problem, and we see that the use of hyperlocal tactical disinformation aimed at causing harm to the civilian population is not well understood and needs to be further researched to take specific measures to protect the civilian population from the harm stemming from disinformation. Thank you very much for giving me the time to talk to you about Civic and Civic in Ukraine. With this, I would like to hand back to my colleague Sergey, who will talk to you about today's topic of our presentation.
Thank you, Alexander. And now, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to present to you some more detailed picture of how civil-military cooperation worked in Ukraine before the large-scale conflict started, but with a stronger focus on how it developed during the phase of big war in Ukraine and how rapidly these developments occurred. Here are some more examples of what CIMIC did and how it is compatible with efficient practices of protecting civilians. For instance, in addition to the very military type of stuff, like finding the places where the military should be stationed, we were engaged in the process of ensuring that critical civilian infrastructure objects are protected. That was absolutely new for us, but as you know, that Russia started a huge campaign of attacks against civilian infrastructure, especially electricity grids, power substations, and it was also our goal of J9 to interact with even private energy companies in order to make sure that these objects are protected. Of course, it was not a panacea, because if you don't have enough anti-aircraft, then no protections can totally ensure the safety of these objects. But at least we tried to ensure that most of the critical parts of the infrastructure was protected. Also, we worked with civilian authorities in terms of evacuations. That was one of the things which was quite overlooked before the large scale conflict. Nobody expected that evacuations will be so essential, and the evacuation plans, we had to help the civilian authorities to develop evacuation plans which are really relevant, and to have them ready for any scenario that may happen. And we had the cases when we had to activate these evacuation plans. Now at Civic, we also work in this area, helping the civilian authorities to be more prepared for such a scenario when you have to do a mass evacuation of civilians. Because if you could see the biggest numbers of civilians who were harmed during this large-scale war, they were mostly attributed to February and March and April 2022, when we had huge movements of civilians, and therefore evacuations is so important. Obviously, we worked with international non-government organizations, and for one of the things that we did, for instance, notification system for in cooperation with UN OCHA, so that the humanitarian aid is delivered to the hard-to-reach areas and to help those communities in these areas. And one more task which I would like also to mention, that under the wartime, you have to generate force more and more. You have casualties among the military and even CIVIC officers, and therefore there is always a constant need in training. Obviously, in ideal world, you can do this training somewhere else, at home bases or even abroad. But if you do your tasks already at the front line, you have to train your CIVIC officers at the brigades and battalions on the spot. And that's what we did. The next slide, please. And a couple of just case studies to illustrate how it happened in the real world. Here we may see the remnants of something which was a very new nursery, just built before the large-scale invasion. The local mayor decided it could be a good idea to provide meals for the military at the nursery of this, at the canteen of this nursery. Obviously, the nursery was not used for its primary purpose, so there were no children there, but still there was personnel who were supposed to provide these meals. And despite all the instructions and despite all the orders that we had about avoiding use of any educational institutions, sometimes it was the good intentions, ironically, from the side of the local government that led to the situation that this nursery was attacked. Gliding bomb hit it and destroyed it totally. Fortunately, there were no military, there were no personnel at that moment, so we didn't have any casualties, but the facility was destroyed. Therefore, then we had to conduct awareness raising sessions with all the heads of the territorial communities, so that they will avoid such practices, even if they had these good intents. The next slide, please. One more case when we had to identify a specific solution for a specific problem. There were two villages very close to the front line, and they were connected with all the other world just by one road. The Russians understood it very quickly, and they started to attack civilian vehicles on this road. And there were several strikes, like 3 strikes within the very short period of time. When the civilian vehicles were hit, there were several casualties, fortunately all of them non-fatalities, but still. And those who provided food to these villages were just afraid of going there because obviously they could be attacked by these anti-tank guided missiles. In cooperation with the Civic brigade officer, our group of Civic officers at the operational level devised a plan so that we could ensure weekly convoys with food and essential items in the nighttime. Because according to our information, in cooperation with J2, we knew that the Russians didn't have thermal vision in this area. Therefore, night convoys could be a good solution, and it worked well. The mechanism included reporting, like at least once in an hour, and after the convoy departed from the Oblast center, reaching these villages, delivering the goods, and then getting back. All of these being done during the nighttime. As a result, we didn't have any strikes afterwards. And that's one of the examples how these tactical problems can be solved. And the next slide, please, which will be the last one. That's about the challenges and problems. And many of them are familiar for you as well. Because the biggest problem is about understanding of Civic's role by commanders. About this added value. Sometimes we were lucky, sometimes we were not. And I think it's general approach so that NATO NXW should be somewhere higher, not at the end of the alphabet. And we, under our conditions, manage to explain to the commanders and the chief of staffs how J9 contributes to both the success of military operations and to better protection of civilians who are our own citizens, because that's the operation on our own soil. Sometimes there were challenges here. And it is, in my view, it's the cornerstone how you can change the situation. Another problem that we had, that's the gaps in high-level policies. Because if you interact with civilian authorities, you must present your mandate. And for instance, there is no mention about the J9 in the national law of Ukraine on armed forces of Ukraine. And if you approach a head of civilian administration, you have to explain it without referring to specific documents, which is a problem. In most cases, we had to rely on trust. And then, of course, lack of resources, because everything goes to the combat unit, but still, Civic officers have to have a resource in order to reach communities, including vehicles and fuel. And now, for instance, we also are developing a special project in order to strengthen Civic capabilities of Ukraine in order to make protection of civilians better. And it also includes training the military on how to interact with civilians. Because as I already said, sometimes military, they are divided from all other world by this invisible glass wall. And it's not taken for granted that if you do your operations in your own country, then you automatically are being supported by your own population. You still have to work on it, and you still have to have these soft skills, how to interact, even with your own population. And two more things which are very close to each other, that all the data that we collected and all the Civic officers in Ukraine were collected were supposed to be processed into some intelligence, into some policies, into some SOPs. And I have to say that here there is a gap, and there was a gap, and still there is a gap in terms of analytical capability. I think that the Center of Excellence could be just a formidable partner in order to help the armed forces of Ukraine, and also have its own benefit for the NATO to work on this, building this analytical capability. Your concept on analysis and assessment that you have your courses, and the next one will be, it seems to be in November, if I'm not mistaken, could be a good platform where we can work on it. And in this way, the policies, these new policies for CIVIC could include the provisions aimed at better protection of civilians. The current doctrine includes such provisions, but it's all about lessons learned from Ukraine, which could help to improve those doctrines that we have and to develop new TTPs and SOPs to implement these doctrines. Here I will stop, and if you have any questions when the organizers consider it to be fit, I will be happy to answer them. Thank you.